All right. Hello. Welcome to my workshop on color theory. So I'm just gonna go through some I guess pretty high level concepts real quick. Uh, Going through I guess the physics and maybe biology of how colors work, and just so we have I don't know, a bit of a theoretical foundation. And I'm gonna dive into I guess mixing paints and answering questions. So yeah. Any preliminary questions? I won't be taking any actually. That will be a mistake. All right. So, I actually got to look at my own notes. So, yeah, okay. Is that still showing up in yours? Yeah, cool. Yeah, cool. So, basically, the first bit's just we see color through our eyes, obviously, but our eyes have what are called cones in them. And then we basically have three types of cones. And they more or less perceive short, medium, long wavelengths of light. And then that more or less correlates to red, green, and blue. Some people, if they're colorblind, instead of seeing all three, they just get two of those or less. And there's also rare cases where people get a bonus fourth. But I don't think any of those people are probably here. Cool. So then now we got the physics of color, which is we're just kind of zipping through this. So basically, light's made out of photons. They're little things, I guess. So whether they're just kind of energy or particles, who knows? But basically, they have different wavelengths, and then the wavelengths correspond to the color that they generate. Um, when a photon hits something, bounces off, it will change its frequency based on I don't know the elements it hits. I'm not actually sure the exactly how it works, that basically means that each atomic element will have a unique color associated with it, which will feed back into later with what we're doing. And that little picture I've got there is the one on the left is representing a spectroscopy, which is basically a way of determining what elements an object is made out of by bouncing light off of it. Do you want me to hold this? And then you can see based on the unique frequencies that come out of that result, what that object is composed of. And then the other one is just showing light bouncing off. Yes. Cool. Um, all right, color models. So there's a bunch of different color models. You would have seen some of these. Most people would learn about the red, yellow, blue. But I'll also be talking about red, green, blue, and cyan, magenta, yellow, which are more used in various industries. But they will be relevant to this as well. So first we'll talk about red, yellow, blue. That's more of a historical thing. I suppose many years ago, color was kind of based around the paints available, and they had determined that this was a pretty good color model for primary colors. Though now with that current knowledge, not exactly perfect, but it's still commonly used in the art world and also just in general because color palette's kind of nice as it is. It's aesthetically pleasing. Um, and a lot of people have just learned from it. You'll find as well with some red, yellow, blue models that the blue actually looks a bit more like a cyan or a turquoisey color, and then the red will be a bit more purpley magenta. So then some red, yellow, blue models are actually just cyan, magenta, yellow in a bit of a disguise with a bit of a skew to it. Some will just use an honest red and an honest blue and a yellow, and then they'll just kind of have a bit of a skewed palette where some colors are a bit harder to mix than other colors. Cool. This slide is about the red, green, blue color model. So that one you would know about if you work with anything digital. That's just how light combines. And as I mentioned previously, we have the three different types of cones in our eyes. So that kind of correlates a bit to how our eyes perceive color. Um, And then if you have a red light, a green light, and a blue light, you can mix those to create different colors. And in this example, I've got the subpixels in an image, like on a LCD or LCD display. Those will be composed of red, green, and blue lights. And then if you work with cameras, those will be composed of subpixels as well. Cool. Cyan, magenta, yellow is this not updating? Oh yeah, it is. Cool. So, yeah, so I should go back a little bit, but with light, when you mix color with light, when you add colors, you get brightness. When you mix with paint or inks, when you add colors, you get darker. So that's worth considering. Um, Cyan magenta yellow is most often used in print. You'll see it like if you ever work in a print shop or if you ever want to get stuff printed professionally, you'll come across it. But you can think of it as the opposite of how the red, green, blue models work. And then cyan, magenta, yellow is kind of more like I guess, a true color model for how paints might mix, but we don't often get pigments that align with that. So even though technically, if you did the maths, you could like mix any color, physically, you have gaps. Cool. Um, how's this going for everyone? I'm just kind of zooming through it, and then I'll be mixing some paint later. Don't worry. There'll be something. I'll be showing some demos. Um, so pigments are basically the particles inside your paint. Pigments can also just come as is. So we'll get stuff like this. Hold on, I'm just gonna show some the thing. That's gonna make a mess of this plot I just realized. But pigments are basically just like colored particles. And we kind of use that knowledge, or I guess not us in particular, but people use that knowledge of like how the elements reflect light in certain ways to combine together into a compound that creates color. So obviously some came about from historically, like I found like this cool blue rock, we can turn that into something, or like scraping rust off and turning that into like a brownish orange pigment. And some more contemporary ones are artificially created, like I know titanium oxides is a good example. Um, all paints have pigment in it, basically, or they might have dyes. That's another thing, though, but we won't talk about that. It's worth understanding that pigments are relevant, and how do I say this? They're composed of like different elements and stuff like that, but due to like limitations of some elements being kind of poisonous and dangerous to be around, we can't make every color out of them. So sometimes we just have to make the best color we can that won't hurt us, and then mix a bunch of those pigments together to get the color we want, or as close as we can get. Um, and is my picture loaded for you guys? The video I got here is going to be a bit delayed. Okay, so how pigments used in paint, how paint uses pigments. So uh, paint is basically a vehicle, like consists of like a vehicle and pigments. The vehicle is like the binder. So usually, so a good example would be acrylic or like a water soluble acrylic medium, or oil paint is another good example, which just uses linseed oil mixed with pigments. And that picture is just oil paint being made. Um, this is just worth knowing because paint can separate. Paint is made out of pigments. You can mix multiple pigments into paint. And then you kind of get pictures like this here where you might have a paint and it looks kind of funny after a while, and that's just because pigments and the binder separate. Um, Paints can have multiple pigments in them, which is worth doing because you won't always get like the right color from just a single pigment. And then sometimes we can have complex pigment recipes to achieve a certain color. Sometimes we'll also have complex pigment recipes so that way we can get a good covering, because some pigments come transparent, some are more opaque than others, but the opacity isn't easy to control. So sometimes, like a good example is yellow is famous for being hard to coat with. Yellow paints don't are pretty like translucent in their nature. So we need to add other colors to make it stick, I suppose, or make it cover better. Single pigment paints are also a thing, which I've got some here to like show some examples. Um, they tend to be a bit more saturated in terms of color. And then if you like to mix paints, which I like to do, single pigments tend to be a lot easier to work with because you don't lose your saturation as you work with it. When you have two paints with complex recipes and you mix them together, you may find that they don't get you the result you expect, and that's just because one paint might have some gray in it, and the other paint might have a bit of gray in it going as well, and then the result looks a bit more desaturated than you'd realize. Where you guys going here? Yeah, cool. So some paints as well. I mean, you guys probably can't see this. I'll see if I can point it to the camera. Is that coming? No, that doesn't look good at all. That's just blurry as. All right. If you go to an art store and you look at the paints they have, the paints will typically say what pigments are in them. There's kind of like a classification system. So when you buy artist paints, you kind of know what you're getting. So if you buy a red, you're not just buying red. You're buying like a Canadian red or something like that. What? Um, you will get a very particular, like you can pick like what pigments you're working with. So that way, if you buy one brand of paint, you buy a different brand, you can match them based on their pigment composition. Um, Artist paints are also good because tell you what the coverage is like, how opaque it is, and how translucent it is, because that does matter. Um, Hobby paints, unfortunately, don't often tell us that. So it can be a bit of a blind magic mixing hobby paints, but you'll find some brands tend to be a bit easier to work with than others. Cool. This is kind of just a bit of a reversion, like looping back into, I guess, the color systems from before. But I'm sure some of you have seen a color wheel before. This is like a neat, handy tool to look up. This is called the real color wheel. You can think of it as it's just like it's like a cyan magenta color wheel, but I don't know if you can see it too well on the screen, but it's made up like it's broken up into a grid. But some of those grids are marked and some of those grids aren't. The grids with a little dot in them are mapped to a real pigment, and the grids without a dot don't have a pigment. So it means if you want to get that color, you have to mix together. So some colors we get naturally, just in nature. Some colors we just have to make ourselves. If you look at the purple side or the magenta side, you'll notice that it's actually a bit, the reddy magenta area is a bit of a, doesn't have any dots in there. And that's like actually one that we just have to mix most of the time by mixing the adjacent colors together. If you just Google the real color wheel, you'll find it. So it's a handy tool. I find it useful. And now I'll get some paint out. So hopefully that'll be fun. Any questions about all the stuff I just burned through? I kind of just went through like a bit of biology, physics, and printing, and cameras, and a bit of everything all at once. So cool. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So pigments are independent of the vehicle. That's a good point. The vehicle doesn't really care about what pigments go in it. That's kind of the good thing about understanding pigments is that if you like, I got some oil paints that I use, and they have their pigments labeled on them. And since I've got some acrylics with pigments labeled on them, I can color match my oil paints to my acrylics. You may find that the end result might look a little different just because the vehicle itself will tint it a little bit, but the pigment itself will be the same. So if everything works out, you should have a pretty solid match that you probably would need you probably need some sharp eyes to tell the difference between. But yeah, so pigments are, as far as I understand, pigments are independent of the vehicle, so that's fine. There may be some weird chemical reactions I don't know about. So yeah. Yep.
You're going to start actually showing mixing paint.
Yep.
What I might do is ask people to move forward.
Yeah, that'd be good. And I can drop this mic.
On the top
okay.
So that they won't see the camera, but can't move forward.
Yeah, that'd be good. Do you want to scoot forward?
As you can see, we've got a camera pointing at the bench. So,
cool. Any other questions, I guess? Okay. So I kind of put up some like random one, but I guess maybe some things to talk about would just be like, has anyone here actually tried mixing their paints? Has anyone had any issues with their paints or random questions about that?
I find it amusing when they talk about mix 80% with 10% and 10%. How do you judge the 10% and 80%?
I would say for me, this is kind of like I guess getting more familiar with like how the color wheels and stuff work because sometimes what you'll find is so actually this will tie into a good point. Sometimes what you'll find is you want like a reddish color, for instance, right? And you're like, okay, but this red is too bright. I need to like bring it down a level. And then you think about it, it's like, okay, well, what's going to desaturate that? What's going to do without like making it black? And it's like if I just add like a little bit of green, so it's like 80% red, maybe like, or maybe 9% red, and then like 10% green, they'll push it down in desaturation, but still make it red, for instance. So I would think of it as kind of like dialing it in, like what your like goal is, what your goal color is, like a starting point, and then you're like thinking of tugging it in different directions with other colors. Does that make sense? So it's something that you get more familiar with once you play with it a lot more. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like I mentioned that the red, yellow, blue color wheel isn't like 100% accurate, but it's still like a pretty good tool. And a lot of people just have one lying around from like their youth or whatever. The cyan, magenta, yellow is a bit more accurate, but at the same time, use whatever works. But you can lean into those and just have a play around. So I think a good example might be we'll just do some stuff now, I guess. So a good example might be just like trying to make like a skin tone or like
Had a lot of trouble trying to get skin tones.
yeah.
It's like a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of something else, and try for skin tones, it's really tricky.
It does get kind of hard, yeah. So I found that like I'm kind of just making this bit up, so we'll just see how we go. So if I make a fool of myself,
One of these all oils.
no, these are all acrylic paints. I just have like paints in little tubes because I think it's fun. Um, so I guess where's my brush? Like if you think about a skin tone, like what color is it? It's like kind of like an orangey color, right? So then we're gonna get like a big blob of this. Can you guys? I'll bring this more into the center there. We'll get some yellow. We start mixing it together. It gets a bit too red.
So does the colour wheel help try to work out what colours you need?
Yeah. So
For
here,
particularly skin tones?
yeah, exactly. So here I'm actually just kind of breaking down into like fundamental colors. So I just got a magenta, a yellow, and like a turquoise, and I'm just going to try and get there with just using those without actually using like any other colors. And we might use like a white or a black as well. Um, I may not get it perfect, but we'll see how we go. So we kind of get like a bit of an orangey color there, and that's kind of like a good starting point. We might like want to like line that up.
So you tend to work down from darker to lighter. But that's just
This is just how it's working out right now. I guess I'm just trying to push it in directions I know it's going. Right? So like, I'm not gonna be able to tell you the recipe that I just did here at the end of the day because I'm just making it up as I go. But you can kind of see that like, okay, now we're getting a bit like lighter, and this is kind of more in line with like the value, I guess, that we'd expect. But it's still pretty orange, and it's a bit saturated. So I'm just gonna give it this guy here and just mix it. Or maybe I put too much in there. We may have gone too far. That's okay. But this is like a good example of just playing around. So this is like a lot more green over here. Oh no. Bring some red back in there. You're gonna watch me fail in real time. It's okay, I brought a skin tone
okay.
paint just in case.
Trying
Yeah.
to get skin.
Yeah. Alright, I may spend too long doing this. I think that's actually
Explains different. Like we use white to mix those up. It's what you're using different.
it's the same fundamentally. I just prefer these paints. So I think this is getting closer. I think that's close enough. I don't know. How's that look? So I guess the point I'm trying to get at here is that like you kind of mentioned like the 80-10-10 rule. So here I would guess this is kind of maybe mostly the yellow, like 60% yellow, 35-ish the magenta. I don't know. I'm going to go over 100%, a bit of the turquoise to bring it down, and then like a bunch of white to like make it more pale.
And does the color wheel sort of give you those basic
Yeah. So think
four
of
colors to then start?
yeah, exactly. So then we can think about. I mean, I could just cut straight up do a color wheel, and then we can kind of talk about it as we go from there. Realize I'm going to go through this palette paper like crazy. I do want to talk about other bits, but I thought this would be a good starting point. So let's slap some yellow down, and I guess what I'll do is I'll just try to. I got this kind of dirty. We'll just do like some swatches and just mix them together next to each other.
While you're doing it, one result I found real at art supply shops, you often get a book that's got recipes in it.
Yeah.
Dozens and dozens of pages of swatches.
That's
So that's what I'm after. So you
This kit was kind of good because it had like a recipe page on the back. This is for some other paints. It is just worth just because you don't need a lot of colors to mix. But if you want to play with mixing, you don't need a lot of colors. I would just say get like the cyan, magenta, yellow, a red, blue, red, green, and blue, and the black and the white because you can technically mix red from cyan and from magenta and yellow, but it's never going to be like a bright red, so you're just going to spend a lot of time. So just do that. So we can kind of see like we got some stuff going on here. Like we got a green there. We mix,
Sort of critics say water will be quite
yeah. Uh, I kind of did this a bit dirty, but this should give us a bit of an orangey here over here. It should be red, but it's going to turn out orange. And if we mix the turquoise and the magenta, we should get a blue. Of some description. So that's just kind of like throwing it together yourself. And then we can kind of curve it in. We're going to keep cleaning this guy so we don't muddy those ones up. And get the different extremes. Okay. Maybe we'll just park it there. Cool. That was like a bit of a demo of like basic mixing. Was that helpful? Yeah. Huh? Oh, tilt it up. I realize, sorry, I'm looking at the camera thing here, but I realize it's not displayed on the other screen there. Yeah, so that's just kind of a quick talk about that. But like, we can kind of do more practical examples where one example I have written there is just like a 5 o'clock shadow. So sometimes you'll see like sometimes you'll just have a skin tone like this. So this is kind of like a light pink skin tone there. And then you'd be like, I want to put stubble on a guy, but he's still got skin there. And then if you think about it, stubble kind of like, it just kind of grays out the face a bit from a distance. So when you look at it up close, it just looks like pink and speckly. But if you're doing a guy this big, you're not going to be painting every individual hair. So in that case, you kind of want to lean into like this brush is probably too dirty. So in this case, it's kind of like leaning into like the color models and the color wheel, and we're like, okay, well, how do we desaturate like the pink? And it's like, what's like on the other side of that? And it's like, well, we kind of go into like a blue or like a turquoisey or green space even. So we just kind of jump over to like a cold color. So we can even get a bit of this guy here. We mix that in there. Maybe we put too much in there. And we get like something a bit more muted there, a bit more desaturated. And sometimes you might just have to add like a black or a gray or something like that to help. Yeah, just a touch. But the point here is that like you just try playing with different colors to see how they interact. And by like getting like thinking about how we can apply the color wheels, for example, we can nudge the colors into the direction we want just with a bit of mixing. When it comes to like building recipes for like if you're like, I don't know, I've seen like some videos where people are like do what you described with like just the all the
20% of this. and
yeah,
20%
get
of
this and
something
that.
else.
Like, you don't just come up with that. That's like, I played around with these colors for like a while. I did some swatches on paper, then I tried things out. And then eventually I came to this recipe and I felt like that was good. And then that's when you scale it up and you're like, okay, 10% of this, 20% of that, blah, blah, blah. I don't do that a lot, to be honest. I just kind of mix it because I do lots of characters anyway, so I don't need a consistent recipe. And I can usually just remake it from the get go. Yeah, cool. Any questions around that?
So what's the paint?
So I got two paints here. These are just like these are kind of more common in like the I guess the figurine like the scale sorry the like the wargaming or not necessarily wargaming but like the figure painting scene. So these are scale artists. They just come in a thick tube. I like these because the paint comes out really thick, and it's easier to thin paint than it is to thicken paint. These ones are called Chimera paints, and I'll show you some of those in a sec. These are single pigment and they're super dense. Sorry, super saturated. Yes, super saturated pigment. So the paints are like, I don't know, like 50% pigment, 50% volume or something like that. So you get super saturated stuff. But what I like about these guys is that in this case, they're a really good example of showing how like the translucency of paint, because a lot of pigments will come out pretty like translucent. Uh, and then you just kind of got to accept that. So, I mean, I kind of made a bit of a mess here, but I guess this cover's pretty nice because it's on white, so you can kind of see that. But we go around, do it on like the gray, the black even. We spread that around. We're just gonna see it just kind of disappears really quickly. I kind of slapped a bunch of this guy, but you can kind of see the coverage is like not super great. I know a lot of people have problems with yellows and reds in particular because they just don't like those pigments themselves don't have great opacity to them. And then we got to kind of either add opacity to the paint itself, or we got to put like a light color underneath them so they come about. So we do a light here. So just by getting a bit of, no, I'm not shaking this up properly anyway. We'll be fine. So if you find you have paints like that, sometimes just mixing a little white, like it'll make the paint lighter, but if you mix a bit of white into it, the coverage will go up a fair bit. This may not be a great example. So it's a bit paler, but then when you come through for the second coat, you can kind of, oh, I got some green in there. Oops. Disregard that one. So just kind of showing like the difference. Obviously, it's no longer the same color, but the coverage will improve. And then you can kind of think, if you just add a bit more white, your like coverage will just go up like crazy. And that's because titanium oxide, which is usually what you find in white, is just extremely opaque. It can come out a bit chalky sometimes though, so that's one thing to keep in mind. I don't have it with me, and I left this one at home, but there's another white called zinc white, and that's actually transparent white. So if I had done this with the zinc white, it would probably look a bit like this, but just paler. So it's worth actually paying attention to what kind of white it is.
It's interesting, different background give you a different color.
Yeah, exactly.
Painting tanks, they say you can layer it.
Yeah,
So they talk about giving a black coat or almost a little bit. And then you go for a little coat. It changes slightly the color.
yeah, it does. Yeah. So let's see how this red looks. It does change it a lot. And then I guess the other bit is that it's also like you have a similar thing with metallic paints as well. Metallic paints are extremely dependent on their undercoat. I haven't really looked too hard into it, but I think it's like kind of the same basic principles in that like you just need like if you have a black coat under there, then like the shiny metallic flakes in there will kind of reflect a bit better, be a bit more obvious. But if you have like a white coat underneath the metallic paint, it kind of washes out a bit. So I think this will be actually this is a much thicker paint, but this is just kind of showing like this red paint conveniently has a really good coverage. You can kind of see even with that, there's like still like a bit of transparency to it. So this end is going to be darker than that, and naturally, but it's something that we can also use to our advantage sometimes. Because sometimes you might paint a model, and some people do like what's called like zenithals, or they'll do like value sketching, where they'll paint the lighting of the model, like so they paint the model black and white with the airbrush or something, or even rattle cans sometimes. So the lit up parts of the model are white, the darker bits are black, and then they'll add,
Shadowing.
yeah. So just getting the shadows done before they add color. But when you start adding color, acrylic paints have a natural transparency to them. So then you can kind of lean into that natural transparency and actually get your shading from, or you put your work in, but you don't have to go back and readdress it. Um, cool. What other? Oh, those are kind of like my main points. Any other questions? I guess.
But you can thin those paints right down.
These ones are really good for thinning right down because because both these brands are.
As like a tell you what, do nothing else.
Yeah, so I'd say that with the what I like about these paints is that both these brands you can thin really far down and still have paint to work with, like still have pigment to work with. So you can go all the way down to like a thin glaze or a wash, and then you can work with that. While some paints they break, so to speak, so they will just separate, or the pigment will just be split across like different parts of like your new vehicle, I guess, your new body. So that's the thing to keep an eye out for. I like both these brands because you can thin them to like no end.
Do a wash and then
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I like is like you could get like a so this is like a pretty like saturated magenta. You could get something like that, do like a character model, thin that down crazy, or do it with an oil wash where you get like a magenta oil, thin that down, and then you can just do it as a filter over skin tones, and then you can kind of add like a bit of a blush or like a bit more like warmth to the model without making it like purple. You can just kind of add those tones in. I know that's kind of like a similar approach, like mixing the paints, except for instead of mixing now, we've got thin layers going over top just to add that complexity and push those colors the directions we need. Yeah. Cool.
I think the basics is the colour wheel. It's a good starting point.
Yeah. So yeah. This guy's great. The real color wheel is really useful because it's kind of like it's based on what's physically out there, and then you can mix based on that. Uh, what else do I want to say to that? Just try mixing your own color wheels if you're mixing with paints. It's a bit harder with some paints. Like if you're used to using like enamels or huh?
Oh,
Yeah.
to the real color wheel, is there a way to calculate the colors that aren't pre-mixed to the non-dotted?
Yeah. So the dotted ones are based on real like existing pigments, and the other ones you just have to mix yourself. Is there a way to calculate it? Technically, yes, but it's a bit more complicated. So
Not as easy as, oh yeah, you go 90 degrees that way, 90 degrees that way, mix those two.
yeah, I've found like this is like a bit of a tangent, but I found like a tool, like a plugin online for I think it might have been for Photoshop or for some painting software, but it was they basically did that where they got pigments and they mapped like a color model. So instead of just working with red, green, and blue, each point of the color model was actually like a linear basis based on each pigment, and then they use like lots of math to just mix it together like as if it was real life. So you can. It's just a lot more work than you realize, or maybe you do realize, but it's a bit more work than just this and that. But really, like the easy answer is just play around with it yourself. It's much faster just to get some paint and just goof around. Um, I'd say if you want to try mixing paints, you can mix with all kinds of paints, but if you just want to do like this sort of stuff where you're just mixing on paper and trying things out, uh, oils, acrylics are really good just to play with. Oils have long drying times, so if you have a wet palette, use acrylics on the wet palettes just to extend their drying time so you can play around with it a bit more. Lacquers and enamels can be mixed. They're just a bit harder to experiment with in the same sense because they kind of dry pretty well. They start to dry once you suck them down. So you could try mixing them with the airbrush, for instance, and seeing how that goes instead, because that seems to be a more natural place for them. Um, yeah. There's also sorry.
How do you find pigments in colours or just the texture?
Sorry, what do you?
So when you add in some pigment,
Oh, so these are all just regular pigments. Just, oh, I mean, you mean these, like the pigment. Pigments do actually change the texture a fair bit because these aren't as finely ground as what you would find in a paint. But I mean, you can just mix it in with paint. Like, it is effectively the same thing at the end of the day. Um, Pigments are just kind of fun because they just come out kind of muddy. I do like to use pigments with paint sometimes because you do get like kind of like a grittier texture.
yeah,
And if you want to do something like a rust or corrosion, for instance, then that it dries looking really gritty like rust. And I mean that's basically why I have these two. It's because they're just different types of rust. Peter also wanted me to talk about lights, but we don't have any examples with us. But it is worth just mentioning color temperature is a thing. Um, this is kind of going back more into the physics stuff before, but if you think about it, like the light you see is like white is just made up of all kinds of light mixed together. Sometimes you get a bit more of this and a bit more of that, and then the color kind of skews a bit. So color temperature, you want about like 5,000 ish K or like a daylight when you're like painting, just to help get a more accurate representation. Another thing that to make it more complex is we got a thing called the color rendering index. So you may get a daylight light bulb where it looks like a daylight light, and it is in terms of white, but then the way they mix, the way that light was mixed, may not represent colors accurately. So you may actually like find that the colors that come out might be washed out in some way. So maybe they'll come out a bit more blue or a bit more red than you realize. Um, cool. That was my final slide. Any other miscellaneous questions or oh, too much? Too little?
I really never gave it much.
I'm like you, 20% of this and 30% of something else, and a light skin and a dark skin.
Yeah. Well, I found for me it was like I ended up. I mean, I went to art school, so I learned this stuff implicitly. But when I was painting my own like figures and stuff like that, it was just kind of like the best way for me to get like a warm, like to do a skin tone was like I picked like a base color to be like the mid tone or whatever, and then instead of picking another paint to be the highlight or the shadow, I pick paints to push and pull it in those directions. So I may never go to my highlight color fully, but I just kind of mix up towards it. Yeah, and then yeah, exactly. And then to add interest across the model, we may not want the colors to be as uniform. We may want to add like some blue over here to like make it darker and general, and red over here to make yeah. So there's just a lot of playing around, to be honest. Yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, I should have brought some models to show up. I didn't think about it. Yeah, cool. Um,
Skin tones are eyes.
yeah, yeah. All right, cool.
And they figured that we will do.
This is scale color artist. Scale
So is
75.
that from the like one of the war gamer shops? Or?
Some of them do. Yeah, it's kind of this brand's kind of weird because they do like wargaming, like originally they did wargaming paints, and then they kind of got more associated with being more for figure painting. So then they started to skew towards making figure painting style products. So these are geared towards that. But yeah, have a look.
I have seen something
Yeah.
similar.
I think you can buy it. Yeah, Rodin sells it.
Yeah.
I know we get
thought it was Avolute.
Absolutely. Yeah, so they make oil paints. That's a different brand, but they do kind of the same thing, but with oil paints. Yeah.
I've never seen the acrylics in the tube. They use Vallejo.
Yeah. Well, if you go to an art store, right, and you buy like the Windsor and Newton or like the no, those can be acrylics as well. You can get acrylics in the tube. So most of the artist paints at the arts like at Eckersley's or whatever, that's gonna be in tubes, or unless you get like the big bottles. And stuff. But, yeah.
That's the obvious what they were oils.
Yeah, so I
First time I even thought you could get acrylic tubes.
there's a I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think the brand's Artist Spectrum, but they're like an Australian brand, and all my oil paints I got just through Artist Spectrum, but like they're all artist grades. If you do use oil paints and hobby stuff, like the artist stuff is the same. It's just different. Like it's just a different branding. So and you can get a lot for about the same price.
Whereas I use the Vallejo and
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do as well. Because one from like if you want to just paint like if you want to paint some Warhammer models or whatever, you might find that sometimes if you're painting a little guys, that this thick paint is a bit more of a chore. If you want to like hunker down and focus on like one character or something like that, this is like really fun to play with. If you just want like even coverage, like the wargaming paints are like more, yeah. So there's definitely I use a bunch of different things. I didn't think to bring it, but I will use water. I'll use what's called flow improver. You can just get that. I think Liquitex makes that. I have different mediums like matte medium and stuff like that. A glaze medium, and just water as well. Yeah, and they all do different things. So some stuff will make it take longer to dry. Flow improver breaks the surface tension and makes it flow a bit finer. So if you have like a really fine detail brush, well, if you want to do like really fine details, right, flow improver is great because it makes it like just flow off the brush really easily, and you can do like a just like a hair stroke, like hair strokes and stuff like that, or little scratches. So you can just kind of cross hatch and yeah, and then but the water is really good if you want to make your own like glaze or wash or something like that because it does thin it down in a way that you can kind of spread across easy. They all have their own merits though, so it's just I didn't think to talk about that because I figured the colors would take long enough. Yeah. So maybe I have to do a workshop where we don't even talk about color; it's everything else. the rest of paint.
Thank you
Oh, you're welcome.
very much. Appreciate it.